Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ray Padrone, and I have the privilege of being one of the members of Brightworth's Investment Committee, and I also happen to be the firm's managing partner. Now, back in the fall, when we decided to call this event Managing Wealth in a Rapidly Changing World, we had no idea how we could have predicted this. We're not that good. But the fact of the matter is, when oil prices drop from $100 a barrel down to below $30 in a short period of time, that creates uncertainty. And uncertainty creates volatility. As we look back, as we entered this decade, we're halfway through the second decade of this century. At the beginning of this decade, we also had uncertainty. We had high inflation. We were in the Great Recession. 4 jet airplanes were hijacked and changed our world. Tech bubble burst. Uncertainty. Beginning of the 90s, the decade before that, not quite so bad. We had our first Gulf War. We actually had congressional hearings on the size of the national debt. It's almost laughable now. There were books being published called The Coming Economic Earthquake that were making the bestsellers list. Think about the 80s. 14.8% sizzling inflation rates, 15% treasuries. People were trying to start families with 18% mortgages. Then there's my favorite decade, the 70s. Besides the bell-bottom pants and the platform shoes, I remember waking up having to think about whether it was an odd day or an even day, just so I could wait in line for an hour to get gas in my car. We could go on and on. 60s, Cuban Missile Crisis, plenty of uncertainty. Yet, throughout that entire period, the S&P 500 has gone up over 2,000%, adjusted for inflation. We put a man on the moon. We've increased food production, where we are feeding millions of more people than ever before. Millions of people around the globe have been lifted out of poverty. We have broken down the human genome, the physical universe, and information to the smallest unit. And we are just now learning how to leverage that knowledge. Do you know that we can do on this phone and now a watch what Dick Tracy only could imagine? Now, I realize on purpose that I probably lost half the crowd there, and you have no idea who Dick Tracy is. But there's a point to this, which is please turn off your cell phones. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, there has been a lot of change, and change has been constant. And that change creates uncertainty. But along with all of that uncertainty over the decades has come tremendous opportunity. Our speaker this evening, Peter Zeihan, is going to be sharing with us the major political trends that we have been watching unfold on our TV sets every day. He's going to be speaking for about 50 minutes. We'll have a 15-minute period where you get to ask Peter some questions about what you heard. And if you are not comfortable standing with a mic, we'll have teams of folks with mics. If you're not comfortable, on your table is a card. You can write your questions down. We'll do our best to get those collected, and I'll try to get those facilitated into the Q&A session if at all possible. After Peter speaks and we have the Q&A, we'll have about a 15-minute break, and we will promptly, and there's the key word there, promptly get back in our seats, and I'll be introducing the rest of the Brightworth Investment Committee, and Don Wilson, our Chief Investment Officer. He's going to talk about how what you've heard from Peter is articulated into our global investment strategies and our clients' portfolios. At the end of Don's talk, we'll have a full 30 minutes for you to ask questions. So you can ask not just about what you've heard, but maybe you have questions about the current economic conditions, what's going on in the markets, and any questions you may have about Brightworth. We'd be happy to answer that. At the end of the Q&A, you will have the opportunity to pick up a gift from us. Peter Zeihan and Brightworth are providing all of his book, The Accidental Superpower, which a lot of his talks can be based on. And Peter's been kind enough also to be able to stay this evening. He'll be happy to autograph books if you'd like that as well. So thank you very much. Now, before I introduce Peter, I have a quick story, and it's actually a true story and an unembellished story. It's about 25 years ago. And by the way, I think this story kind of captures the theme of what you're going to hear tonight from Peter and Don Wilson from the investment committee. About 25 years ago, I was with a client, and he had had really nice returns building up in his portfolio over the last several years, and I was very concerned that his expectations for the next year might have been a little bit too high. So I go into my importance of diversification and multiple asset and he goes, Ray, I know what you're going to say. He goes, I understand that portfolios go down. I understand that portfolios go up. I just want to be near the top of the heap. With that, I'd like to introduce to you Peter Zeihan. Peter is a geopolitical strategist. He examines how demographics and geographics are driving the developments around the globe, whether it's cultural, political, or military. He addresses audiences like ours. He addresses Fortune 500 companies, industrial companies around the globe, as well as energy investors. He started Zeihan in geopolitics in 2012, and he wrote his first book, The Accidental Superpower, in 2014. When Peter's not speaking, and he does speak a lot, he is putting the finishing touches on his next book. It's called The Shale New World, and is expected to be published next month. Peter previously served as Stratford's Vice President of Analysis, where he guided the information of the firm's global forecasts. He joined Stratford in 2000 and has at various times directed Stratford's European, former Soviet Union, Latin American, and energy teams. Peter's been featured in countless and numerous newspapers and broadcasts, including the Wall Street Journal, CNN, AP, Bloomberg, New York Times, Fox News. Prior to joining Stratford, Peter worked for the U.S. Embassy in Australia and was formerly with the Center of Political and Strategic Studies in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Peter Zeihan.
Good evening, everyone. This is normally the part where I'm supposed to launch into a witty anecdote so we can bond. That's what my college professor always said I was supposed to do, but he was kind of a jackass, so we're just going to go right into this. Okay, the middle of this map, the tan area, that is why the United States is the global superpower and will continue to be the global superpower long after our grandchildren are gone. Why? It's not that it's the world's largest chunk of arable land. It's not that it outproduces the next two zones combined. It's actually the blue lines that crisscross that map, the greater Mississippi system. 13,500 miles of navigable waterway. Now, why is that important? Well, moving things from A to B is a bit of a bear, but if you float them, it's 1/12 the cost. And those 13,500 miles are more waterway than the rest of the planet put together. In addition to the fact that we have another 4,500 elsewhere. In addition, the United States has forests and lakes separating us from the Canadians, deserts and mountains separating us from the Mexicans, which makes the United States not just the richest physical geography in the world, but also the most secure. Ocean moats. So if you take nothing else from this presentation, please take this. Even in the worst case scenario where somehow there's a third Obama term, and it always works in the South for some reason. And halfway through, there's a freak crocheting accident, and Vice President Donald Trump takes over. And we spend the next 24 years bouncing back and forth between the Clinton and the Bush legacies. We're going to be fine. We can't mess this up. We have tried. Now, back in what we Americans think of as ancient history, the world was imperial. The French Navy protected French trade between the French mainland and the French colonies. The Brits did the same, the Japanese did the same, and so on. Sequestered imperial economic structures. You did not trade with your neighbor if you could help it, because you never knew when some idiot whose language you didn't understand was going to throw a war, even if it didn't involve you, and you would lose access to whatever the raw material, the market, or the trade access was that you thought was so important. So if you felt you needed something, you went out and you got it, and you folded it into your own empire. These systems competed over resources, over energy, over trade routes, over markets. Those competitions turned into wars, and those wars ultimately culminated into the Second World War. And at the end of that war, the United States was really the last one standing. And we decided we were going to try something fundamentally different. Instead of everybody having their own slice of the globe, we were going to pool everything into a global whole. And we would protect the trade that would enable everyone else to export their way back to affluence. Nobody else needed a navy. Our navy was at the global disposal. Everyone could export to anyone in the network. And moreover, we opened up our market duty-free to everybody who was in the economic alliance. And make no mistake, that's what it was. It was an alliance. NATO is the military side of the free trade order, not the other way around. There were a couple of catches. The biggest one was you had to allow the Americans to fight the Cold War our way. It worked. Great. The Soviet Union was contained. Global GDP increased by a factor of 10 in 70 years. Global population tripled. It was the greatest period of peace and prosperity in human history. How did we enforce it? Not all that complicated. The carrier on the right, traditional jump carrier. The one on the left is a super. The supers have 7 times the combat projection capability of the jumps. There are 10 jump carriers in the world. Not one of them is American. There are 10 super carriers in the world. They're all American. And we're in the process of decommissioning all of them to replace them with bigger carriers. We have enjoyed a 10-to-1 ratio in offensive firepower projection on the seas since 1945. And the ratio is now going up, not down. And we don't use it at all. The United States doesn't use Bretton Woods. For us, it's a security program, not an economic one. As a percentage of GDP, we are the least involved economy on Earth. 2 years ago, we were looking at a grand total of 11% of our GDP from trade, total, about 7 to 9% based on who's doing the math from exports. That's it. That's all of it. And that number's going down, not up. So that's our baseline. Now let's talk about the 4 things going on in the world that are going hideously wrong and why we can't do anything about them and why that's not a problem. So number 1, the US labor force is shrinking. Because of the retirement of the baby boomers, we are looking at a future of less workforce, lower incomes, higher tax needs, lower consumption. It's called deflation. It's bad. It's unavoidable. It's uncurable. Here's how it works. This is a normal demography. Children on the bottom, teenagers, young adults, mature adults, retirees. Simple mortality makes it a pyramid. Fewer people at the top, more people at the bottom. Now, in any demographic profile, you need to identify 3 different groups of populations. The first is your young workers, people who are roughly aged 20 to 45. With these folks, it's all about the consumption. It's the houses and the cars and the kids and the college and the pot. Spend, 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 spend. Thank you. But they're at the early part of their spending, they're at the early part of their income. So they haven't brought in enough money to power all the spending they need to engage in. So it's car loans, it's house loans, it's college loans. So high consumption, high growth, but also high debt. Then you've got your mature workers, people roughly age 40 to 65. The kids are moving out, the house is being paid down, maybe you're downsizing. You're not concerned about consuming very much anymore. Your big worry is what happens in retirement. So you're socking money away from the future. So it's high income, low spending, low consumption, low growth. At the same time, this is where the tax base is. So government loves the mature workers. And then you've got your retirees, people who step back from the system, swap out their bonds and stocks for T-bills and cash. Can't take the volatility, certainly not foreign volatility. It's a strict capital model because that generation in the middle is providing the capital for the generation down below that's bigger. So house loans require a mortgage. Your house is the collateral. Business loans require a business plan. Crazy concepts. Do we have any Canadians in the room here today? Anybody? What the hell's wrong with you people? Well, apparently back in about 1974, you forgot how to have kids. Pretty sure you got the basics down. You have a big bulge in your populations in the late 50s and early 60s, the most capital-rich demographic you can possibly have, which means that Canada right now can afford one of the world's most generous social welfare states and have enough leftover couch change to pay for the Athabasca tar sands. It's fantastic. Never had this much money relative to the population ever in not just Canadian history, but human history. However, in 7 years, that bulge moves into mass retirement. And Canada will be going from the most capital-rich population to one of the most capital-poor. And all those people in Canada that are paying taxes will then be getting benefits from their equivalent of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And there's no replacement generation. Consumption-led growth hasn't happened in Canada in over 20 years. And it's impossible for it to happen in the next 30. Investment-led growth is happening in Canada right now, but that will be impossible in 7 years. That just leaves exports. Canada is now a one-track economy, or is about to be. Here's the United States. Now, where are my baby boomers? People who were born between 1946 and 1965. Don't be shy, hands up, come on. Yep. Freaking Roman legion, that's what you people are. Now, the problem with the boomers, well, one of the problems with the boomers, is that there's too many of you. And so whenever you do something, you just do it too much. And when you entered the workforce all those years ago, you took all the jobs that were available, and you discovered there still were a lot of you without jobs. So you had to take positions that were beneath your skill set. You pushed your own labor costs down, and you've been doing that your entire professional careers. And now that you're nearing retirement, you're doing the same thing with your investments. Because all of that investment capital from that whole bulge is seeking any way to make an extra 1%. It's the chasing yield problem. And especially now that you're at the verge of retirement, you just want to get that last little bit while you still can. So Enron, your fault. Subprime, your fault. The brick boom, your fault. Trying to find a way to blame you for nylon. Can't yet. But very soon, all of that money is going to come home. Because you're going to need it. You're going to not be able to take that volatility, particularly the foreign volatility. And so the amount of capital that's in the world right now is at record highs because of you. And very soon, that will invert. Now, do we have any Gen Ys here? People born in the last 2 decades of last century. You know, it's been a couple of hours since sunset, so some of them are actually awake now. Okay, so we got like 3. Gen Y are the boomers' kids, the echo boomers, the millennials. They're the second largest generation we've ever had, and they face exactly the same pressures in the job markets that their parents did. There's too many of them. Now, they have got a couple things going for them that their parents didn't back in the day. First, they're the best educated population we have ever had. And so when you're talking about the Uber economy where everyone has a new career every other week, they're actually pretty well prepared for that economically, psychologically, socially, politically. Second, half of them still live at home. And of the half that have moved out, half of those were only able to do so because the bank of mom and dad is helping with the rent. We are in the midst of the greatest financial transfer, generational wealth transfer in human history without anyone actually dying yet, which is a disaster for this last group. Gen X, that should be most of the what's left on here. People born between 1966 and 1980. We're all here. We're the smallest generation in American history. And we were screwed from the get-go because when we entered the workforce, We discovered that the boomers had taken all the jobs, so we were the perpetual intern generation. Our income did not come up to the generational average until about 2 years ago when the boomers finally started retiring. And now we have to pay for the boomer retirement. So the 75 million retiring boomers paid for by 11, not 11 million, just 11 Gen Xers. Yeah, oh, it gets worse. Because Gen Y will never vote to repair or fix Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. Because if that were to happen, benefits would drop, and the boomers would have to move in with their kids. And from Gen Y's point of view, that's strictly a one-way relationship. But thank God they're there. Thank God for the millennials, because in 15 years, when the millennials mature, and I'm using that word in its loosest possible way, they will fill out the tax-paying class in a way that Gen X never could. And right now, when they're young, they're consuming in a way that Gen X never did. They are the future of the world. And they don't exist anywhere else. Everyone else in the developed world has the Canada problem. There are no German Ys, or Italian Ys, or Japanese Ys, or Korean Ys, or Thai Ys. None. So in just 15 years, the United States evolves from being the world's largest consumer power and the world's largest financial power to being the world's only consumer power and only financial power. Now, the road from here to there is going to be a bit rough because we have to get through this period where Gen X is paying for the boomers, and that's going to be hard. The marginal tax rate is going to have to go up because there is no political solution to the Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid problem, except for the boomers saying, why don't Gen X pay for everything and just suck it up? They wonder why we're bitter. But in 15 years, because of Gen Y, this fixes itself, just not anywhere else. So that's problem one. It's a big problem, even here, but we recover, nobody else does. Problem two, let's talk about a few other countries. Top left, that's Russian Federation. You see that gouge down near the bottom? That's the post-Cold War baby bust. 60% drop in the birth rate. If the Russians are going to use military tactics in an attempt to reshape their world, they have to do it now. Because very soon, the entirety of their military will be of people born during the bust. So they are. Top right, that's Japan, the world's oldest society. That's probably not a shock to you, but what about this? Here's Korea. Korea is the world's fastest aging society. Taiwan's number 2. Bottom left is Brazil. Nice pyramid. That's what we think of when we think of a young, developing country. This is the demand of the future. This is the future economy of everything, right? No, that's 1990. Everybody else is 2015. Here's Brazil today. Brazil is aging at 6 times the rate of the United States. And by 2040, they'll be older than we are. Bottom right, People's Republic of China. 25 years after the one-child policy, they're running out of 25-year-olds. People tell me the Chinese are good at math. It certainly doesn't exist in the data. That's actually a lot worse than it looks. See this little blue haze here? That's the surplus male population. When you have a patriarchal society like China, and you tell people they can only have one kid, female infanticide is very common. There's a 10% sex imbalance in most provinces. That's a lot worse than it sounds. Because when the Chinese manufacturers, the industrialists on the coast, realized that they were facing labor costs that were rapidly rising, they've increased by a factor of 10 in the last 11 years. They went inland to find new workers. They only brought back the women. Because you can put 6 chicks into a 300 square foot apartment. You do that with 6 dudes, you will have a severed head in the fridge by the end of the month. Men and women of childbearing age in China are not simply separated by socioeconomic status now, they are separated by physical province. This is a terminal demography. That's the first crisis. Here's the second one. on the topic of China. I gave a presentation on, July 27th, when everything went belly up. Wow, that was a colorful crowd. They were all from Asia. So, the Chinese know they have a problem. Here's the problem they know they have. The Chinese system is based on financial leverage. The idea being that you politicize the money supply, you politicize the depositor base to force feed so much credit through the system that everybody has a job. If you can guarantee even just one job, you pretty much can qualify for a bottomless supply of 0% loans. Now, in 2007, which was the year of the US subprime crisis, this was the most overcredited year in American history. We still haven't gotten back up to that kind of lending. Total Chinese lending surpassed total American lending, despite the fact that their economy was less than 1/3 the size of ours that year. It then tripled in the next 18 months because nobody was buying the crap because of the global slowdown. They then came up with new and creative ways of force-feeding more money through the system. They now actually have a line item in their central bank for loan sharking and money laundering estimates. Let's bring this down to scale. What can't you do with a bottomless supply of 0% loans? You guys remember the Obama stimulus package, right? $800 billion over 3 years. Or over 2 years, that was 3% of GDP. That we were thinking at the time, there's no way we can spend all of this effectively. There's going to be fraud. There's going to be corruption. We were right. This is an Obama stimulus package now every 20 days. Will you get growth with this? Well, yeah, how can you not? But eventually, you're going to run out of someone else's money, and it all comes crashing down, and their financial system on the depositor and the lending side will collapse at the same time. Something to look forward to. Now, the Chinese know about this problem, and they've been taking steps for the past several years to try to build a parallel system that can take over when the financial system finally does crack. The first thing that they did was something called the Go Inland or the Go West model. Now, the brown on this map, that is where people actually live, densely populated China. You'll notice that the left side of the map, which is the south, southern China from roughly Hong Kong down to Shanghai, you've got a series of coastal cities that are isolated population pockets. The idea of go inland was you take these coastal cities, you leverage them, and you build an interior economy that becomes consumption-led, and that in part supplies the coast. The problem is that those successful world-class cities like Hong Kong, like Shanghai, don't have an inland. You go directly into jungle mountains, or at least subtropical mountains. The only place you can go inland is in the north. And you go into the interior of northern China, but northern China has no navigable river. So you had to first lay down subsidized infrastructure, and then build a subsidized industrial base, and then subsidize the educational system. Which means that anything you produce out of there has to be subsidized. That's why the lending in the last chart skyrocketed so much. Now, you take a bottomless supply of capital, and you marry it to a political goal, and some weird things can happen. You start getting development in places you probably shouldn't. Those are China's ghost cities. They've got over 100 of them now that conservatively can house 50 million people, probably a lot more. But this isn't my favorite one. This is my favorite one. That is not Paris. This is Tiandushan in southern China. Designed to house about 30,000 people. 4 years after opening, it's about 15% full. Most of the people who live in Tiandushan work at the adjacent construction site where they're building a Paris theme park. Love it. Now, you take a bottomless supply of capital, and you marry it to the idea of giving everybody a housing space. Because, you know, as we know in the American experience, if you have a house, or even if you just have an apartment, you then have to fill it with crap, right? That's like 2% of GDP every year in the United States, filling your house with crap. They want that 2%. It's a good plan. Unfortunately, whoops, that's not what I wanted. Unfortunately, that made a bubble in the housing prices that people actually wanted. So nobody wants to live in Tiandushan. But if you have an apartment in downtown Shanghai, you can sell that sucker for $3, $4, $5 million. And if you've never had any money in your life ever, what happens when you're suddenly a millionaire? Well, you go out and you buy yourself a car. The Chinese have a term, tu hao, which roughly translates as Beverly Hillbilly. And that's the people who have become millionaires after selling their apartments. They can't drive these things. There are more Porsches and Lamborghinis in garages that have never been driven in China now than the rest of the world put together. Fun fact. Well, after you have your car, what do? Because you still have all this money left over. Well, you play the stock market. 80% of holdings in the Chinese exchanges in June of last year, before the bubble burst, were retail investors. Not pension funds, not government funds, not foreigners, retail investors, domestic. The only economy, the only market in the United States that meets that kind of criteria is Kickstarter. Ask the 3 Gen Yers what those are if you don't know. So the Chinese know that every system that they've tried to build to get around this over-leveraged problem has now become leveraged itself. And the financial bubble, the housing bubble, the development bubble, the stock bubble, they're all bolted together at the hip, and they're all in the process of failing. And it's just a matter of time, and I would love to be able to tell you that it was going to be next week or next year, but it's all a matter of time before this all comes crashing down. And so they're getting ready for their backup plan. Consolidate political power, Mao style, into a single person. So that when your average Chinese citizen looks at the TV and sees Xi, he says, I don't have to eat, I don't have to be able to feed my family, but I trust him, and that's enough. And the way that Xi is doing this is this anti-corruption program. It's not designed to fix China, although if it did, that would be great. It's designed to publicly execute enough people who are known to the public so that they trust him, that they believe he has their best interests at heart over the long run and will do what's best for the country. And so already we have seen more power consolidated into Xi than into any of the old empires. Mao himself is the only person in Chinese history that is now more powerful than Xi is today. And that's their best case plan now. And when that happens, China will close itself off from the world, civil unrest will be the norm, and we go back to a China that looks a lot like what it did in the 1950s and 60s. And that's not an American problem. Now let's talk about the other side of Eurasia. The northern part of Europe, from France to Poland, the northern European plain, that's the second most concentrated chunk of capital in the world. There are 11 major river systems that transect the plateau of Central Europe, flowing across northern Europe to the sea. And each one is its own economic heartland. If you're going to exist in Europe, if you're going to have a market in Europe, if you're going to have an industrial base in Europe, that's where it's going to be. That's where the money is. That's always where the money's been. But that's not all of Europe. Down south, you've got peninsulas, you've got mountains, you've got arid zones, places that are more expensive to develop. And so you've always had this split between the northern European plain and the rest of Europe over who has the money and who's in control. Now, under Bretton Woods, everybody was in one gigantic, big allied trading family, and it didn't matter so much. And the Europeans thought, okay, we need to find a way to make this stick with our own mechanics, with our own druthers. So they created the common currency, the idea that the surplus capital of northern Europe could flow into the periphery, particularly southern Europe, and develop it, bring it up to northern standards of education, of infrastructure, of consumption. The moralist in me, the Atlanticist in me, thinks that this was a brilliant plan. The economist in me thinks this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Because they didn't do this in a vacuum. They did it in the context of a free trade area that spans the continent. And let's say you're living in Spain. You're a Spanish citizen living in Madrid. Do you want a German car or a Greek car? And that's all you need to know. Because the interest rate is the same for both. What the Eurozone has done is gutted the employment and manufacturing base of Southern Europe and moved all of the capacity and all the jobs up north. And every day that the Eurozone continues to exist is a day that the periphery of Europe falls further and further behind. Let's talk about the Greeks. Gray line, that is where the IMF estimated that total state debt in Athens was. And you'll see it peaked at about 100%, 180% of GDP as of 2015, and it was expected to fall back after that. Now, you may have heard that the Greek government got a little persnickety last year. And so there were a couple of revisions throughout the year, culminating in that red line, which was in July. As of the deal that was agreed to in November, here's where we actually are now. 200% of GDP, 220% of GDP. The blue line, by the way, that's Japan. That's the only country in the world you can now compare the Greeks to. Now, the Greek economy is not very developed at all. There is not a US state that is behind Greece in terms of industrial and educational development. It does very well in a comparison with, say, Chiapas in Mexico, for example. How do you manage a debt of 220% of GDP? Well, the answer is you don't. If Greece is forced to suck up its debt, they will disappear as a country within a decade because the debt is continuing to expand. They can't even force it down. And yet the Europeans, the Germans in particular, are not allowing any negotiation on the topic. The debt is Greece's. Greece will have to suck it up, and if that means Greece disappears from the map, so be it. Well, that seems pretty stupid from our point of view, doesn't it? The problem is the other solutions are worse. Solution number one would be to do a big write-down. Take it from 220% of GDP down to maybe the 40 or 50% that the Greeks could actually handle. But if you throw in corporate and personal debt, Greece is not the worst of the bunch. Cyprus is. Ireland's worse. The Netherlands and Belgium are worse. And so if you're going to do a big write-down, you have to do it to more than just Greece. And can you imagine in the United States, if all of a sudden all of the debt west of the Mississippi was written off, what would happen to the banks out east? It's cross-collateralized. It's linked. You would have an end of the European financial model within a matter of weeks. So this solution, despite what the Greeks want, was tossed out on day one back in 2007, and they've never gone back to it. The third possible solution, kick them out. Grexit. Sounds sexy, doesn't it? Grexit. I just like the sound of that. Let them devalue. Let them start over. Let them export with the drachma where they'll be competitive again. Well, here's the problem. Greece will have then defaulted on $1/3 of a trillion US in government debt. Greece imports 100% of their energy and 80% of their food. Who in their right mind would give them so much as a letter of credit after a giant government default like that? We have seen how the Europeans have failed to deal with 100,000 Syrian refugees. Greece is in Schengen, passport-free movement. Can you imagine if 8 million Greeks just showed up in Bavaria next Tuesday? So this option's off the table. It was floated once as a negotiation ploy, never again. So letting the Greeks die a slow, painful, horrible death, that's the best solution. What the Europeans need is an exit plan for the euro, a plan B for the European Union, and they don't have a lot of time to come up with it. This is the Club Med demography. I like Club Med rather than pigs. I think pigs is unnecessarily insulting. That, Italy. Now, you'll notice that there's this big bite out of the bottom of the demography down here. Again, the Canada problem. But this is 2000. This isn't today. This is 15 years ago. What happened 15 years ago? The euro formed. And interest rates in Europe for a car dropped from 18% to 3%. They didn't have kids. This is the perfect demography for spending. Lots of people in their 20s and early 30s with no kids. It wasn't diapers and rent, it was Maseratis and vacations. And the Europeans became convinced that the consumer surge that they saw in the early years of the euro was the new normal. But 15 years later, everyone's 15 years older. On the right side, it's Greece and it's Italy. You cannot get the same consumption profile out of people in their 40s. More importantly, you can't get kids out of people in their 40s. Not even in Italy. Bottom left, there's Poland, not in the Eurozone, but they're one of the big consumption centers in Europe right now. Now, they're a little bit younger than the Italians, but they're actually dying out at a faster rate because of the post-Soviet collapse. So that's a real consumption moment, but it's just a moment, and in 5 years it'll be past. Top left is Germany, the oldest demography in Europe out of everybody except for Belgium. Now, this is both good and bad. A lot of people in their 50s. That means that the German export machine is amazing. These people are very well-skilled engineers. They can compete with anyone on quality. And because they're in the same currency zone with Greece, they can compete with anyone on price for about another 8 years. And then that big bulge of mechanics and engineers and designers age into mass retirement. And that's the end of German exports. Even worse, right now, they can afford the Greek bailout system. But in 8 years, all those taxpayers start drawing pension checks, and that money goes away too. So the Europeans have 8 years to figure out how to fix Europe, how to make Europe work without exports, without consumption, and without money. Good luck. Problem 4. There are a number of technologies working through the shale sector that are revolutionizing how everything works. There's 2 in particular I want to talk about. First, we got something called 4D seismic. Now, 2D seismic, two-dimensional seismic, that has been part of the portfolio for quite some time. The idea is you have a sound truck come out, do a little sonar image of the formation before you. You get a little 2-dimensional image of what it looks like, and you use that to make an educated guess as to where to drill. 4D seismic, you keep sending those sound bursts down, you get a 3-dimensional picture of the formation, and you see how it adapts in real time to your activities. And the results, they're just absolutely gorgeous. We know exactly where every molecule of petroleum is now. There's something in the shale fields that's called the 20-80 rule. 20% of the frac stages generate 80% of the petroleum. Well, now we know which ones are which. So you don't frack the ones that don't have anything. And our drilling techniques have improved drastically since the onset of the horizontal drilling era 10 years ago. Used to be that you'd go 600 feet. 5 years later, you were going 6,000 feet, 10 times the reservoir contact per well. Then we figured out how to combine the surface infrastructure, and you'd send upwards of 20 vertical straws down, each with their own horizontal spur. Now, we're doing that all from one pipe. The usage of labor and water and sand and pipe in the shale fields has dropped by 70% in the last year and a half. Not because drilling has let up, production's actually increased, but because the technology's improved. Until very recently, about a month ago, we haven't been in an energy-induced recession. We've been in an energy production input recession. Very different thing. Which means this is what's going on here. This axis is volume of output. This axis is price per barrel for break even. Shale's right here at the end. As of, 4 years ago here, very high cost, not a lot of output. Because of these new technologies, here's where we are today. The break-even cost around the big 4 shale fields in the United States is now below $45 a barrel. In many places, it's now down as low as 30. Now, in today's price environment, it still sucks. Consolidation is the name of the game. I don't suggest that you go and throw your money at oil fields. Not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is it doesn't take much of a change in the current price structure to make the majority of American shale output profitable again. In addition, once you've brought it online, the operation costs for every shale well in the country are still positive. Break-even costs from an operational point of view for many of these fields are under $5. So none of it is going to be turned off here. Elsewhere in the world, yeah, but not in the United States. Which makes this supply portfolio pretty stable. Blue line is American liquids production. Red and green are imports from Canada and Mexico. Double hash is 2007. That's the year that shale became a real thing in the United States. That's consumption. 3 things happened in 2007. First, we had a recession. Industrial output dropped, consumption dropped with it. But the recession ended almost 7 years ago. Consumption still hasn't bounced. First time ever. Second, something called demand destruction. When you're convinced that oil prices are going to be higher for longer, you change the way you consume energy. You put up solar panels, you drive a Prius. I did both. And that reduces not just your energy footprint today, and not just for as long as you're in that house, but as long as that house is standing. And those Priuses, Prius, whatever, they're going to be on the road for 20 years because they're freaking Toyotas. Each Prius takes 150 barrels of demand out of the equation, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that there's 4 million of those suckers on the road. We had energy prices above $80 a barrel for 10 of the last 11 years. There are thousands of technologies that have been implemented and invested in and installed that are eking away the American the American consumption footprint, and will for another decade at least. And then finally, demography. When you're 35, you take your kids to school, you drive to work. When you're 55, you just drive to work. And when you're 75, you don't drive much at all because your kids are trying to take away your car. Per capita oil demand declines with age. And in 2007, the oldest of the baby boomers entered retirement. We are looking at secular demand decline in this country for at least the next 20 years, which means that that black line and that stack of colors could cross as soon as the end of next year. The total gap right now between North American supply and North American demand is less than 2.5 million barrels per day. During the shale revolution, we've had years where we've added almost that much in new production. So if there's a price hiccup, let's say we just go up to 60, let's not go crazy, just 60, that'd probably be enough. Back in 2007, the global energy market was basically two big islands, North America and Western Europe. All the energy in the world basically flowed to those two markets from about 30 different places. Lots of arbitrage, lots of contracts, lots of sources, lots of refineries. Everybody had their own play. And if you were a super major, things were grand because you could play all of this against each other. If you were vertically integrated, horizontally diversified, life was fantastic. And anything that you had left over, you could ship to East Asia because they would take anything. Didn't matter if they could process it, they would try because they were at the end of the world's longest supply chain. Saudi Arabia to Japan alone, 7,500 miles. You get to 2015, and that pattern changed. Two big reasons. One, the European financial crisis had been going on for 7 years. Europe is still a smaller economy today than it was 8 years ago. And energy demand has cratered because of it. Here in the United States, we saw imports drop by 1 million barrels a day for 7 straight years because of shale. So instead of the two continents getting their supply from a very diversified wide array, we're really each down to only about 3. For the United States, it's Venezuela, Mexico, and Canada. And for the Europeans, it's Norway, Algeria, and Russia. And if you're going to sell your crude, you can't go to these two markets anymore. Total demand is down by over 10 million. You have to go to Asia. So whereas in 2007, the Asians paid premiums for their energy, now they're getting discounts. And it's getting a little bit bigger with every passing day. That's not going to last. Very soon, there are going to be a series of disruptions that are going to change the way these supply patterns work. The United States is going to go its own way. We're very close. North America is very close to self-sufficiency. There's not going to be enough crude left to supply East Asia. So we're going to have this split system between the United States, where supplies are by small private companies, where it's short-haul transport, where it's easy financing, where it's reliable consumption, a global system that is 2, 3, 4 times as expensive, where it's long-haul shipping and state-owned companies and hard financing and difficult transport, and Northeast Asia, where there's just not enough crude. And what that price scenario looks like, I don't know, but it's going to be ugly. And it's going to change every day based on who can get a cargo in. Now, there are 3 things that are going to cause this to happen, any one of which would be more than enough, and I think all 3 of them are going to happen. So scenario number 1, the Russians. We've talked about how the Russians are desperate, how they know that their government is not going to survive the next couple of generations. They just don't have the people. Now, there's a series of barriers on the western edge of the Russian periphery The red zone in there, that's the majority Russian population. There's a series of barriers right along that, the biggest of which is about the same height as an interstate on-ramp in Kansas. We're talking broad, flat, open areas. Now, the Russians look at this map, and they see these 5 arcs as the gaps in the geography between the seas and the mountains that they need to plug. Right now, they've got 3,500 miles of exposure. But if they can anchor in those 5 points, 3,500 miles shrinks to 600 miles. That's something they can hold with a much smaller Red Army. Here's all the export infrastructure for oil and natural gas. 6 to 7 million barrels per day of crude transport capacity, 15 BCF a day of natural gas export capacity in the potential invasion zones. So whether it's the Russians turning it off in order to get a leg up on a target, or target turning it off to get a leg up on the Russians, this is now throughput and output that is in danger. Not to be outdone, Persian Gulf. I could go on and on and on and on about Iran and Saudi Arabia, but think of it this way. One, the United States has kept an aircraft carrier battle group in the Persian Gulf for most of the last 70 years in order to enable the global trade regime to have fuel. That is no longer an overriding American concern, and in the last 16 months, we've only had a carrier on station about half the time as a result. This isn't the new normal. This is the transition to the new normal. And the Iranians and the Saudis are starting to go at it. Already, they're on opposite sides of 7 major conflicts in the region, 4 of which are already hot wars, Syria being the loudest. They are opposed economically, philosophically, politically, militarily, and because of shale, economically as well. They are now, because North America is not in the mix, exporting exactly the same product to exactly the same customers along exactly the same routes. That's going to end badly. But really, you just need to think of it this way. It's kind of like the University of Texas, Texas A&M rivalry, but with more guns. And like all of the world's great rivalries, eventually fans end up in the wrong bar. Here in Kyle Field, aka Khuzestan, you have 3 million ethnic Arabs in Persian Iran. They're seen as a 5th column because they are a 5th column. Khuzestan, unfortunately, is home to 80% of Iran's oil production capacity. The Saudis are trying to spark a revolution there. Not to be outdone, down here at the UT Tower, aka the Gwar Superfield, the world's largest, you have 2.5 million Shia in Sunni Saudi Arabia. The Sunnis think of them as a 5th column because they are, and the Iranians would love to spawn a revolution there. In fact, they executed 35 Shia leaders last month in order to get a leg up on the problem. That's what the most recent spat is about. That's 11 million barrels per day of oil production and export facility in just those 2 spots. That assumes nobody else gets caught in the middle. There's 25 million barrels per day of production and export capacity at risk. And then, of course, East Asia has their own problems dangling at the end of that supply chain. Because any supply cutoff anywhere in the world has to be eaten by these 4 states: Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and China. They are at the end of the global supply chain. Everybody else takes their cut before it gets to these 4. Which means if you're these 4 and you want to have energy, you don't just have to pay through the nose for it. You have to sail your navy to the Persian Gulf, take sides in a Middle East knife fight, and then sail with your crude under military escort to get it home. And we all know that those 4 countries have a centuries-long history of brotherly love and cooperation, and nothing could possibly go wrong. It's actually a lot worse than that sounds, and it has to do not with energy, but with trade. Pre-Bretton Woods, most of the world's manufacturers came from these gigantic manufacturing complexes. All the stages of production were in the same general area, and then the final product was shipped out. During Bretton Woods, this ended. And anyone who had a competitive advantage would take a little piece of that process. It's not so much that the car was assembled with the spark plugs here and the tires there, but those got broken down. You had the O-rings here and the ball bearings there. Thousands of different steps and hundreds of different facilities assembled in a dozen places along the way. That's our economy now. The first time that one of the Northeast Asians shoots at, much less hijacks or sinks an oil tanker, that's the end of the diversified nature of the global supply system. Because you raise the cost of energy, you raise the cost of transport, you raise the risk that makes Bretton Woods possible, it's over. We're on the very edge of an era where inputs and production and consumption don't just need to be guarded, they have to be co-located. And the only place in the world that does that is North America. 95% of the American economy is on the continent. And not only are our two biggest trading partners our immediate neighbors, they're also about to become American-fueled. By the end of next year, a series of infrastructure projects will reach completion, which means the United States will be the largest exporter of electricity, refined product, and natural gas, with most of all of that going to Mexico and Canada. And don't forget Cuba. Tiny little Cuba. Should be on your radar already because of the tourism boom. But a couple other things are just around the corner. One, sugar, which you've probably thought about. As soon as the embargo goes away, sugar is going to be coming in. But also manufacturing. The workforce in Cuba, the educational system, is about 3/4 as good as it is here. The labor costs are only 10 to 15% the American standard. So think of the economic revolution that has happened in Mexico since 1985. And now take the chaos in the international system and plug Cuba into NAFTA and CAFTA. Brilliant play. Guess which part of the United States gets to take the most advantage of that? You. The American Southeast. All the booms that you guys have seen in manufacturing and auto in the last 5 years, Cuba fits perfectly into that framework. You want to look a little bit further abroad, there's one part of the world that the United States is going to remain engaged in, and that's Southeast Asia. Now you look at this, the green, especially the dark green, that's tropical, there's a lot of mountains, it's the worst possible physical geography to develop. It's expensive, it's difficult, there's disease. Most of the people in Southeast Asia work in tropical agriculture, which is to say they hate their jobs. Because agriculture is hard, but tropical agriculture sucks. Not only do you have the diseases, but there's no chance of moving up the value-added scale. You know, if you're growing corn or wheat or soy, you can apply technology and capital, you move up the value-added scale, harvest more, earn more money, become richer. You can't do that with pineapples. Pick them up, plant them one at a time, pick them up one at a time. Which means that if you're in tropical agriculture in Southeast Asia, you try to get out. And you move to the cities. Here we have a population density map. It's the most urbanized part of the world. But because they're islands that are mountainous and jungle, these cities don't have a common infrastructure linking them. They have to trade via water. So you have low-cost industrial centers like Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City, based on your politics, or Java. You have mid-tiered centers like Kuala Lumpur or Bangkok, and you have high centers like Singapore. But because they're all super saturated with labor within their own market, they all work for less than you would expect. This is global trade in miniature. Every single one of them is a de facto, if not formal, US ally. There are more people in the coastal cities of Southeast Asia than there is in coastal China. And they're a lot less politically persnickety. And they're young. So this has legs. This is the one part of the world where demography and physical geography actually work together outside of the United States. Okay, I think I'm almost out of time. I want to leave you with this map. The 2 circles are for the 2 zones I think you should consider if you're not already. Those are the places that have the people, the money, and the trade system that can actually last into this new era. As for the colors themselves, the blue are the masters of the chaos. They will do very well in the era to come. Green, more or less where they are today. No big gains or losses. Yellows and browns, that's where things start to fall apart. The yellows are states that have something going for them. A unified ethnicity, a good educational system, an ally they can trust, self-sufficient in food, something. They're still going to be looking at a worse world, but it's one that they're going to continue to exist in. The browns, not so much. These are countries that are going to be overwhelmed by the challenges in front of them. And while they may still nominally exist as countries, really not in the way that we think of them right now. And as for the reds, if you don't know the names of the red countries right now, don't bother learning them. They won't be there in 5 years. Okay, I think that's the first time that I've ever had an audience that has laughed at every single joke. So thank you for that very much. Sure. The blue one? That is Angola. Just let me preface this by saying that just because it's in blue doesn't mean I actually like them. In Angola, the wrong people run the civil war. The ethnic group that won it did it by genociding a couple of million people. And Angola has a physical geography that is very similar to Russia's. There's just really no series of barriers anywhere near them. So they are in the process of doing a second genocide in their own country and intimidating all of the countries that they border so that there's a whole ring of states that are too scared to do anything else. And it's working very well for them. That, and they got a lot of energy. They're loaded.
Question over here.
I have a question about food supplies.
Sure.
As it pertains to us. And I've heard that the Saudis are buying up our farmland. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Sure. First things first, the United States is the most food-rich country in the world. So there's no need for absolute or relative food supply concerns in the United States. Second, on the issue of foreign ownership, less than 1/10 of U.S. agricultural land is in foreign hands. There are national, state, and local restrictions on land sales. That, and for any of those of you who know a family farmer, that land doesn't come up for sale every day, or every decade, or every generation. So it's just not liquid. Mm-hmm. The Chinese are throwing money at anything they can find right now as a way of getting stuff out. Yes, they want the security of having their money in a place that has some rule of law. Fun little story. I've got a friend of mine who works in financial crimes for the FBI. And like all of his stories, they begin with him sitting in boxers, eating his Cheerios, watching cartoons. Knock on his door Saturday morning, and it's two Chinese citizens, one who looks like he's about 30 and one who looks like she's about 330. They offer, sight unseen, to buy his apartment. And he's like, it's not for sale. He's like, well, how much might you sell it for? So he figured out what he paid for it. He doubled that number, appreciated it a little bit, figured out how much it might cost to move to Milan, because he'd always wanted to do that. Gave that number. There's a 6-second conversation in Mandarin, and 3 days later, they were handing him an aluminum suitcase full of 50s. And he works for financial crimes. The 5 gateway cities, New York, Miami, Santa Monica, Seattle, and San Diego. The reason why rents and land prices in residential have skyrocketed so much in the last 5 years is primarily capital flight out of the European and the Chinese system. Every single financial center in the world last year sent money to the United States. There was $2.25 trillion of capital flight. So are they trying to buy up farmland? Yes, absolutely. They're trying. They're finding that very difficult. So they're just buying whatever else they can. It's starting to leak into commercial real estate as well. So you are going to see asset price inflation in a great many sectors, with real estate just being the biggest over the course of the next few years, because this is just the beginning of the great run for the exit. This isn't the end.
If some of the news has suggested that immigration will help our population distribution, and then secondly, that Africa has a lot of youth, and that may change their potential.
Sure.
So if you comment on some of
Let's
that.
start with the second one first, because it's an easier question. Just because you have a good demographic doesn't mean you're going to be economically successful. Because if you can't integrate them, if you can't train them, if you can't give them jobs, they're really, young people are just problems. And I hate to say it, but the Middle East is a shining example of that rule. You've got a large young population that just doesn't have enough to do. Africa itself is built on a series of 5 plateaus, so try running a rail line up a plateau. There's really not much of a chance for Africa to do well. It's doing okay right now because of the baby boomer financial bulge. So it's got a few years left in it, but only a few. The broader question on the United States with immigration, about half of our population growth is because of migrants. The other half is, to use an incredibly loaded term, native born. And if you include the children of immigrants in that, you're looking at about a 75-25 split. So it does help a lot. But keep in mind the caliber of immigrant that we're getting. We're getting people who are upwardly mobile, who, even if we don't think much of, say, the Mexican or the Central American educational system, will admit that it's better than nothing. It's certainly better than what the Syrian refugees are coming into Europe with. They're of a much more similar ethnic and cultural and religious stock than, say, the migrants into Europe. But most importantly, they come young. Your average Mexican migrant is under 20. Your average migrant into Canada is 46. So in Canada, in Europe, with these, you get skilled migrants there because people they can't walk there. They have to get a plane ticket, which means they've had a certain socioeconomic background to afford that ticket. They can't pay into the retirement programs enough to actually pay for their retirement. Whereas we get immigrants from Central America who walk in and work their entire working lives in the United States, and yet Mexico had to pay for their education. This is brilliant. I mean, that saves you like $150,000 a migrant. So, yes, it's a huge net positive for the United States. I don't mean to suggest there aren't complications. There are. But we're getting a group that is much easier to assimilate, that is also much cheaper to assimilate.
Yeah, Gen Y representative here. So one of the central themes of your book is the U.S. abandoning Bretton Woods and the free trade agreement. But with the signing of the TPP and
Sure.
Seems like a doubling down of free trade, will the Americans actually follow through with that and
Sure.
let the system go?
Let me start by saying I really hope I'm wrong on this point. But when I hear people like Donald Trump saying that he will forcibly renegotiate all trade pacts with our allies, and people like Hillary Clinton saying that she does not support the trade deal that she personally negotiated, which is the TPP. And by the way, the Obama administration came out this last week and said they have no intention of submitting the TPP for ratification. That's more of an admittance of reality, because if they put a bill before Congress right now that was to obliterate and criminalize the Democratic Party, it probably wouldn't pass this Congress. TPP in its current form isn't going to happen. It's not that it's a good or a bad deal. It's just it can't happen with this Congress and this administration. And whenever a big trade deal like that is finished in the final year and then it gets left to the next president, it gets renegotiated. So if we do get a TPP, and some version of TPP I think is a good idea. It's a regional deal that plays to U.S. strategic interests. Whatever we get isn't going to be the deal we have today. But the tenor of American politics on the left and the right and in the center has changed. And we aren't getting the same perceived benefits from free trade that we used to. And this has been coming for a good long time. Part of Bretton Woods was to build that cordon of allies to ring in the Soviets. The Chinese were part of that cordon. But now that the Soviets are no more, it really just feels like a lot of freeloading. And that is one of the reasons, the big reason, why both Trump and Clinton can agree on the free trade point. The only politician that is currently in the field, left or right, that has not said anything negative about the trade deals is Kasich of Ohio. And I believe he's polling at like 2% nationally, maybe like 11% in New Hampshire. And that's it. So who would I vote for? Sure. Well, let's start with the resource question. We have no idea. No serious prospecting has been done in the South China Sea at all. So is there oil, is there gas? Who knows? We just don't. We do know that the Chinese don't have the technology to exploit it if it does exist. It would have to be the Western supermajors for the most part. Setting that issue to the side, if it came to a hot war with the United States, which is not what the Chinese are after, those bases, those sand islands would last about 30 seconds against the US Navy. So the US Navy loves it as a war drum to beat, but they don't see it as a threat. The reason that those bases are being built is not the United States, it's Vietnam and the Philippines, because they don't really have navies. And the Chinese want to browbeat those two states into accepting the American maritime zone. It's backfired. because now Vietnam is actually having quiet conversations with the United States about moving back into Cam Ranh Bay, and the Philippines have already invited us back to Subic Bay. Now, I'm not saying we're going to, but that gives you an idea of how much the tenor of the strategic discussion in the region has already shifted. The Japanese are starting to regularly base intelligence assets out of Thailand, out of Vietnam, out of the Philippines. They're cycling through their military aircraft through Taiwan. The Chinese realize they don't have a good hand to play in this, and they've played what they've had badly. So I wouldn't worry about all that too much.
Question over there, Nathan?
Yeah, I was curious if the other blue dot in Africa was Rwanda. And
Yes, it is
if so,
Rwanda.
could you comment on Rwanda's economy? and
Well,
prospects?
their foreign policy is almost as bad as Angola's, but at least for them, it is a foreign policy and not a domestic policy. Rwanda has fought a series of horrendous wars in Uganda and Zaire, which they have won. And they have basically established a buffer zone for about 400 miles to their north, southwest, and west that is now, in effect, an extension of their own country. And there's absolutely no reason to expect them to lose that in the next 15 years. Economically, I mean, they're a highland African country. They're not an economic superstar in the way that Angola could be, but they're self-sufficient in food. They don't have a petroleum industry, but they don't use petroleum. So they're actually in a position where they are the strongest neighbor of everybody in their neighborhood, they're the strongest country of everyone in their neighborhood, and under the rules of that game, no one can beat them. The question is comparing the cost between Saudi Arabia. What I'm using there is the full cycle cost as opposed to just the production cost. So it includes the exploration on the front end, the taxes on the back end, and all the transport and loading.
Can we repeat the question so everybody
Yeah,
can...
the question is whether or not I'm representing Saudi Arabia correct on the price chart. I believed I was actually at $25 a barrel for Saudi Arabia. Yeah. Right. No, you're right. When it comes to just the lifting costs from the big fields, you're talking about $10 to $15 max as a rule. But once you figure in everything else, you got to remember, you're in a desert where it's 140 degrees in excess of 9 months of the year, and the ground moves. So those pipes are among the world's more expensive ones. Now, they're still the low-cost producer in any scenario around the world. And if we get to this fight between the Saudis and the Iranians that I'm anticipating, the Saudis were smart enough back in the 1980s to build a bypass pipeline. They can get 5 million barrels of crude out to the Red Sea and not have to worry about Iranian blockades or counter blockades. Doesn't mean that life will be good, but if you do have this scenario, that 5 million will be earning them more than the 11 million that they currently export via the Gulf.
We have time for one more question in the back.
Yes, obviously the U.S. is not anywhere close to the debt ratio with Greece at 200% of GDP. What's the implications of the national debt and deficit on this sort of bubble that we're building around the U.S. as being a fortress for investments and other activity?
Forget about it, is the short version. For the U.S. debt situation to be a problem, there has to be an alternative, and there is none. The European Union decided to pay for the Cypriot bailout with insured bank deposits, which meant that anyone who could move their money out of a European bank did so. So we went from 5 years ago, the euro being the world's top trade finance currency, to now they're number 5, sliding towards number 6. The next currency down is Japan. They don't want to play. The next currency down is China, 99% held locally. The next currency down is the United Kingdom. They've printed 5 times as much currency as a percentage of GDP than we have, and have run a bigger debt. The next one down is Canada. Don't get me wrong, the Canadians run a tight ship in monetary policy, but there's only 30 million of them. Not enough to liquidate the global system. So I'm a libertarian, I hate saying this, but it really just doesn't matter. Missed opportunities, certainly, but there's just no competition for the United States position as the holder of wealth, as the lender of last resort, as the market of last resort, and so all that capital flight is coming here, which will keep financing costs low, even as or lower than they would be when our demographics turn.
Well, let's thank Peter for his talk this evening.
Thank you all.
We're going to